This conflict is going to have a very damaging effect on global food security, whether in the United States, Europe, or elsewhere. You will see global food prices rise and potentially, in a worst case scenario, global food become more scarce. I am worried about a food crisis across the Middle East from a humanitarian perspective, but right now I think Iran and Iraq are the most vulnerable to such a crisis.
The U.S. relies on imports for a significant bit of its fertilizer needs. It's becoming obvious that it's very hard to diversify in a hurry. So farmers, to say the least, have a problem, especially in the Midwest.
The war has driven up the price of oil, but that doesn't just mean increasing prices at the pump.
That's right. It means the price of vital chemicals rises too. And you might not think about chemicals all day. I mean, it's not how I spend my time. But things like fertilizer are absolutely essential. And when it gets more expensive, your food bills rise.
That's right. In fact, chemicals that come from oil are upstream inputs to construction, cars, medicine, clothing, tech, and even packaging.
This conflict is going to have a very damaging effect on global food security, whether in the United States, Europe, or elsewhere. And so just look at the prices for different commodities. So the price of urea and ammonia, which are both very critical inputs into agricultural supply chains, they're up 50 and 20% respectively since this war began late February. And so the U.S., for instance, we rely on urea imports for about 50% of domestic consumption. And so just with those rising prices, you're going to see a very significant increase in costs. There's also other costs for agricultural producers that are rising. Diesel, for instance, is a modest but significant driver of agricultural costs, and so you will see global food prices rise, and potentially, in a worst case scenario, global food become more scarce. So it's very concerning out there.
Right. Food is one part of this, but then there's also a lot of other products that could be affected. So could you walk us through simply how disruption in the Persian Gulf ends up affecting a plastic bottle or a synthetic fabric jacket in Europe?
Absolutely. So the Persian Gulf and Arab states are very important for global energy production. So about 20% of oil production and 20% of liquefied natural gas or LNG production must traverse the Strait of Hormuz. And so demand for these products is very inelastic, meaning that if the price of gasoline rises, you're still going to want to drive places. And so these outages for gas, for natural gas, and for oil are going to have major impacts on prices. But there's also going to impact petrochemicals. So as you noted, oil is used in a lot of different use cases. So it's used for things like gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, but also petrochemicals. So petrochemicals are a little bit distinct from your typical oil product. And they can be used for things like jeans. They can be used for things like packaging, packaging for food products, plastics, etc. And so when there's outages in the Middle East is an important provider of those feedstocks for petrochemical plants. It's also a very important provider of electricity for many petrochemical plants, especially in East Asia. So the economies of Japan, Taiwan, South Korea rely pretty significantly on LNG exports from the Persian Gulf, especially from Qatar. And so Taiwan, for instance, about half of its electricity is from liquefied natural gas or LNG. And so if Taiwan, for instance, is forced to curtail electricity because of these LNG outages, that will have ripple impacts on petrochemical production in these places. So if petrochemical prices rise sharply, or if you see physical shortages, that will impact a wide array of products.
Yeah, so this oil shock is feeding into all other kinds of petrochemicals as well, is essentially what we're taking away from this. And Janelle, we heard from Joe already about urea and ammonia. We're talking about fertilizer, these, of course, massively important input into the agricultural supply chain, which affects what ends up in the supermarkets and at what prices. But America produces a lot of fertilizer, but it still also imports a huge amount. So where in the US is the shock hitting hardest?
Yeah, so as Joel pointed out, the US relies on imports for a significant bit of its fertilizer needs. And unlike, say, China, that stockpiles fertilizer, the US doesn't really do that. So basically, the fertilizer is bought and then used. And the most obvious region in pain here in the US is the Midwest in the so called Corn Belt. So you have to think of states like Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, where the soil is really flat and they're just about to plant and they would need to be applying that fertilizer now. So corn happens to be a very nitrogen intensive plant. So these are obviously challenging times for rural America. And it's becoming obvious that it's very hard to diversify in a hurry. So there was talk of bringing over fertilizer from Venezuela, but similar to its oil industry, there are problems there around kind of the maintenance of infrastructure. There are some neglect issues. And suffice to say, the conditions for quickly ramping up fertilizer production in Venezuela aren't ideal, whether politically and
Yeah.
economically speaking. So, farmers, to say the least, have a problem, especially in the Midwest.
And Joe, a third of global urea and a quarter of ammonia come from the Gulf. Some are calling this the fertilizer shock. Because fertilizer is so vital for food, should we be focusing more on fertilizer prices than just pure oil prices right now? Is it really that important?
I think you raise a very important point. So this will have major impacts across not only oil and gas supply chains, but also across fertilizer markets as well. And so this crisis also could not come at a worse time because this is in the planting season. And so because of that, because of the cyclicality of planting, if farmers don't have access to these agricultural inputs, their crop yields could be reduced over time. And so this could have a very significant impact on food prices downstream. And so this is something to worry about. I think there's major economic implications for this. So there are different studies suggesting that over 45 million people will increasingly face food scarcity. That's a major concern. Ingalls holds that as income rises, the share spent on food is reduced, but that implies that people with less means have to spend more money on agricultural goods, and so this is going to have a major impact on global poverty. But I would also say that this will have a major geopolitical impact. This outage in the Middle East, arithmetically, will increase the leverage of Russia, Belarus, and China. So China is not exporting. China is not exporting ammonia currently. They do have stockpiles of it. They're very concerned about domestic food security for now. But Russia is the world's largest exporter of fertilizer. Belarus, Russia's very close partner, is a major player in potash markets. And so if this crisis persists, you will see Russia, Belarus, and potentially even China having greater leverage in the agricultural space. And I think that could be a new and frankly worrisome development going forward.
The Gulf countries produce the fertilizer, but they also import most of their food through the same Strait of Hormuz. So how vulnerable are they right now?
Yes, it's a really important question. So just across the board, the GCC countries are in a very difficult spot because of the initiation of this conflict. And so global food security is a major concern for them, but their exports are also reduced. Some countries that rely on tourism or real estate are having at least in the short term, a major shock to their business model, and that business model could sustain over the long term. And so there's some discussion. You've seen news reports this week of Gulf countries potentially pulling out tens of billions of dollars of investment from the U.S. if this crisis continues, and that's in part because of the domestic challenges they face. When it comes to food stocks, my understanding is that most of these countries have sufficient inventory in place. The GCC countries especially are quite wealthy. And so I'm not as concerned about about hunger shortages in those countries. I don't think that's an immediate term problem. But for a place like Iraq, or even like a place like Iran, so Iran has for instance, if we look at food production in Iran, much of that stems from they have to use water for that. Agriculture everywhere is the predominant consumer of water.
Mm.
And in Iran, much of Iran's electricity or much of its water is ground wall driven. It requires electricity to function. And so frankly, if the US or Israel targets the Iranian electricity grid, you could see a potential food crisis and a water crisis because Iranians would not be able to access groundwater. That could also be true in Iraq as well. Iraq imports lots of natural gas from Iran and uses that for power. And so I am worried about a food crisis across the Middle East from a humanitarian perspective. But right now, I think Iran and Iraq are the most vulnerable to such a crisis.
It just goes to show how vital these supply chains are and how everything is so deeply interconnected. Janelle, we've talked about things like packaging, clothing, food, gasoline as well. I mean, all of these could be hit by a price rise increase. I mean, we're seeing prices rise already in many areas. What happened to lowering the cost of living from the Trump administration? Because all of this has come about because of Donald Trump's plans in Iran.
The thing is, you really can't hide gas prices from Americans. Every day they're on the road. You can see them on the side of the road in this big prominent lettering. They are able to make the connection between current events and their daily spending. And it is fair to say that they are blaming the White House for these issues.
You've been watching a sneak preview of our podcast, The Dip, where we cover money stories that cross borders.
That's right. And if you want to check out the full episode, then all you need to do is to scan that QR code that's on the bottom of your screen right now. And you can also subscribe to the podcast.
And we'll be back with more, same time, same place. But thanks for watching The Dip.
The Dip. See ya. Bye.